Ego death. For many, the phrase itself carries an air of mystery, almost an otherworldly quality, as though it belongs not to psychology but to myth. Yet thousands of people have written about it online, sharing vivid accounts of what it feels like to watch the self dissolve. Today we explore those voices, those experiences, and the meaning behind them. When people describe ego death, they speak of a moment when their usual sense of identity collapses. The ordinary boundaries, this is me, that is you, this is my past, that is my future, begin to fade. At first it can be disorienting. Then, if one surrenders, something remarkable happens. The self drops away, and what remains feels like pure awareness. Timothy Leary once described it as complete transcendence, no visions, no sense of self, no thought, only pure awareness and ecstatic freedom. And though such words may sound abstract, those who have walked through it insist that the experience is unmistakable. On forums like Reddit, people attempt to put the ineffable into words. One user explained that during ego death, it felt as though their body was gone, their mind was gone, and all that remained was an infinite field of consciousness stretching beyond time and space. Another said, "When it happened, I became the universe. There was no separation. Everything was me, and I was everything. And instead of fear, I felt the most profound peace I had ever known." Not everyone experiences it as bliss. A different account reads, "It was terrifying. My sense of I was being peeled away like layers of skin, and I clung to what was left, but there was nothing to hold on to. I panicked. My ego fought back, but eventually it surrendered, and what was left wasn't me in the way I thought I was. It was just awareness, without a name." That mixture of liberation and fear is common. Many who encounter ego death describe the initial moment as frightening, like dying while still alive. And in a sense, that is what it is. The death of the familiar self, the identity we carry like a badge. What comes after depends on the mindset, the setting, and perhaps the readiness of the person involved. Some compare it to stepping outside of the simulation of daily life. One writer explained, "I realized that everything I thought I was, my job, my relationships, even my memories, were constructs. They weren't who I truly was. And in that moment of realization, I felt infinite, eternal, untouchable. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced." Another wrote, "It felt like a return home. Like I had been pretending to be human for so long, and suddenly I remembered what I really was. Something far greater, something timeless." Yet ego death is not always treated as sacred. In online communities, some speak of it competitively, as though it were a badge of honor. One commenter joked about an ego death arms race, where people try to outdo each other with ever more dramatic tales of losing the self. Another observed, "It's strange that people use ego death to boost their ego, but it happens all the time. The more you talk about it, the less it seems you really had it." Despite this, the core of the experience remains profound. People struggle to describe the indescribable. They speak of timelessness, of becoming one with God, of watching the self dissolve like sugar in water. They describe floating outside the body, witnessing their life from above, or merging with light so intense that there is no longer an observer, only light itself. But not every story ends with clarity or joy. Some accounts reveal the darker aftermath. One person wrote that after their experience, they felt emotionally numb for years. They could no longer connect to others in the way they once had, and their sense of purpose was shattered. Another explained that after taking a high dose of psychedelics, they experienced ego death, but were left with depersonalization, feeling permanently detached from reality, as though life itself had become a dream they couldn't wake from. They described struggling with anxiety, social withdrawal, and even a sense of superiority, as though they had glimpsed something others could never understand. These accounts remind us that ego death is not a game. It can be life-altering in ways that are both beautiful and destabilizing. For some, it is a spiritual rebirth. For others, it is a trauma that lingers. A person described reaching rock bottom, unable to sleep, eat, or even engage in normal conversation, haunted by the memory of losing themselves so completely. Another said it felt like being trapped in their body afterward, unable to reconcile what they had seen with the life they had to return to. Still, for many, healing and integration are possible. Some call their period afterward the dark night of the soul, a spiritual crisis that eventually blossoms into growth. Through mindfulness therapy or supportive communities, people have reported slowly weaving the insight of ego death back into their daily lives. One described it this way: "At first I was shattered, but after a year I felt stronger, lighter. I stopped caring so much about the little dramas of life. I realized I wasn't just this small self, and that realization gave me a kind of freedom I carry even now." Stories like this suggest that ego death is not the end of the story, but a threshold. It can tear down the house of self, but in the rubble a new structure may be built, sometimes stronger, sometimes more compassionate. One of the most striking real-world examples of ego dissolution comes from Suzanne Siegel. In 1982, while waiting for a bus in Paris, she suddenly felt her sense of self vanish. It wasn't triggered by drugs or meditation, it simply happened. She reported that from that moment onward, she no longer felt a personal I. She lived this way for over a decade, functioning in daily life, even earning advanced degrees, but always with a sense of distance from her own identity. Her case has fascinated psychologists and spiritual seekers alike because it shows that ego death is not only a temporary trip phenomenon, but can occur spontaneously, altering a life permanently. For Siegel, the experience was at times terrifying, at times liberating, but it reshaped her entire understanding of selfhood. Accounts like hers remind us that ego death lies at the intersection of psychology, spirituality, and mystery. Some see it as the pinnacle of meditation, others as a side effect of psychedelics, and still others as a neurological anomaly. But no matter how it arises, it leaves a lasting impression. So what is ego death really? Is it just a brain event, neurons firing in unusual ways under the influence of chemicals or stress? Is it the unveiling of a deeper truth that the self we cling to is only a mask, and that behind it lies pure consciousness? The internet is filled with debates, but what unites the stories is the feeling of dissolution. People may argue about whether it is real or not, but for those who undergo it, the impact is undeniable. Many describe a paradox. On the one hand, they say, "I died." On the other, they add, "It was the most alive I've ever felt." Some insist it showed them the nature of God. Others insist it was only the temporary collapse of the brain's sense of self. Perhaps it is both, a neurological phenomenon that opens the door to timeless spiritual insight. What seems consistent is that ego death changes perspective. Those who return often care less about material success or social validation. They report valuing love, connection, and presence more deeply. They describe life as more dreamlike, but also more precious. As one person put it, "After ego death, I stopped chasing so hard. I stopped thinking life was about proving myself. It feels like I got to taste eternity, and that made the small stuff easier to let go of." Of course, not everyone integrates it well. For some, the shock of losing their identity leaves scars. But even these stories are valuable because they remind us of the fragility of the self, the delicate architecture that holds together our daily experience of reality. Ego death strips that architecture bare. It shows us what happens when the walls fall down. In the end, ego death may not be something to chase, nor something to fear, but simply a phenomenon to understand. For some, it is bliss. For others, it is darkness. And for most, it is something beyond words, glimpsed in fragments, told through trembling voices on message boards, whispered in meditation halls, described in the writings of mystics across time. The stories echo one another across cultures and generations. A great dissolution, a loss of self, and then, if we're lucky, a return. Whether you see it as enlightenment, psychological collapse, or a brush with the divine, the message is clear. The self we cling to is not the whole of who we are. There is more, always more, waiting beyond the edge of ego. And so we listen to these voices, not to idolize the experience or to chase it recklessly, but to understand the mystery of being human, to recognize that the I we think we are is not fixed, not permanent, and perhaps not even real in the way we believe. Ego death shows us the cracks in the mirror of self, and sometimes, if we're willing, it shows us the light that shines through. That is all for this video. As always, thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe if this video resonated with you on any level. I will see you in the next video.